back, and more on government intervention. This next lesson is on subsidies. Let's go ahead and talk about subsidies. They are basically defined as a payment from the government to a firm or to firms, resulting in increased output, lower prices, and reduced production costs. IB, for some reason, loves for you to mention that those production costs have gone down, and I think in a recent exam they even stipulated that you couldn't get the second mark unless you mentioned something about reduced production costs. So please remember that. Please note that subsidies generally are per unit subsidies, kind of like a flat tax or a specific tax is a per unit tax. Subsidies are generally per unit. So basically the government says to a company, for every one of these that you make, we will give you this amount of euros or dollars. And what that ends up doing is shifting the supply curve downwards by the amount of the subsidy at each quantity. Let's go ahead and give you an example. Here we can see a subsidy diagram, and it looks like that everything is not totally proportional because the 2 and the 1 are gone. I should have had a little squiggly line here. But if the equilibrium price was previously 5 and they were producing Q0 and they were given a €2 subsidy or $2, whatever price we're looking at, whatever country we're looking at, that means now that the supply curve would shift down by the amount of that subsidy. So it would, that Q0 quantity, we would now be producing the price to produce that amount would be 3 because the government is giving us money to make more, so our production costs are lower. So the thing is to remember, though, that supply and demand work together to establish prices, and so what ends up happening is the new equilibrium price goes from 5, or the new price is 4, so it goes from 5 to 4 in terms of price, and then it increases in quantity from Q0 to Q1. So we have a increase in quantity and a decrease in price. And so just again, it's just like taxes. Remember that these two forces work together, and so that even though it's a €2 subsidy per unit subsidy, because those forces of supply and demand work together, the price doesn't actually go down by that amount. All right, let's move on. A little bit more on subsidies. Why do governments use them? What's the justification for subsidies? Well, there's a whole mess of them, and let's talk about them. One, governments might say that subsidies make things more affordable. Things like basic necessities, and not only do they make them more affordable, but subsidies usually lead to increased production. So as businesses are making more goods and services, and the prices are lower, so generally it's good for consumers because now they've got more options, more quantities being produced, it's cheaper. Also, producers often benefit, from subsidies. They will be selling more at a lower price, and the government's incentivizing them to produce more. So generally, it usually benefits producers, increasing their revenue and often their profit. Finally, not finally, but I guess there's more than this, but another reason is to make exports more price competitive. So some countries really focus on exports to try to increase that company's market share internationally. So they might give a certain industry subsidies to promote their exports into foreign markets, and that does happen often. Another reason why to use subsidies is also not only to encourage exports, but to discourage imports. By subsidizing our production of our domestic producers, it can sort of lead to lower prices for our goods that we produce domestically and kind of reduce imports. So that's another reason why. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to international economics next year. So don't worry about it too much now, but just kind of make a note of it. All right. Finally, one of the reasons why we subsidize goods is to promote goods that benefit society. Certain things the government wants to increase the output of, things like education and healthcare, and it might subsidize a variety of different projects like public parks or a lot of different things. So governments try to subsidize things that they think are beneficial for society. We'll talk more about that in the next unit, market failures. Okay, a little bit more on subsidies because there's some problems with subsidies too. While generally it's great for firms, I mean they're increasing output and profitability, sometimes it can lead to over-reliance on subsidies, where firms don't know how to survive without the subsidy. And this can be a problem because the governments, go through fluctuations with their budget too, and sometimes say, well, we need to reduce our spending. And one way they do that is by reducing subsidies. Also, if the firms are overly reliant on the subsidy, it can lead to inefficiency. That's another thing to note. Also, one thing that really is kind of alarming with this is powerful industries, big industries with lots of money flowing into them, often will seek benefits from the government and engage in sort of corrupt practices. This is sometimes referred to in economics as rent-seeking, when firms basically, or industries or lobbyists representing firms, will try to bargain with the government or make a deal with the government in order to increase the wealth that they earn, but not actually create anything new. I mean, rent-seeking is essentially that, when firms seek to increase their wealth by not increasing any kind of output. And a good example of this is like the milk industry in Europe or in the United States. Milk subsidies are just crazy huge in both the United States and Europe. I mean, go to your supermarket and you'll notice that you can buy a liter of milk in Germany in some places for like 30 cents. I mean, it's absolutely absurd how cheap milk is. And sometimes, or in the United States also, the government is working with milk companies in order to help them continue to have production be almost too high, and it's benefiting the milk companies, but it's not really benefiting society. And we'll talk more about that in class. Next, sometimes when we give producers a subsidy, it can lead to overproduction. Too many people say, hey, have you heard what the government's doing? They're giving everybody money for making this. Let's make some too. And if too many suppliers want to enter the market, it can cause too much downward pressure on prices, and it can lead to a total collapse. So the government needs to be careful with what they do in terms of how much of a subsidy they give. Consumers generally love subsidies because they have reduced prices. Also, that it helps their disposable income. Now that they're paying less money for whatever subsidized good they need to purchase, they can spend more money on other things. So generally, consumers love subsidies, but they also need to realize that they may need to pay for some of those subsidies with their tax money. Governments can subsidize a lot of different goods, whether that's food or education or healthcare. But remember, in order to fund these subsidies, they need to pay for it. And the way that they can pay for it is they can increase taxes somewhere, whether that's indirect or direct taxes, or they can borrow money, which can be very problematic. So anyway, that's our lesson on subsidies. We'll go ahead and stop there. And the next one will be on price ceilings. Thank you for listening, and we'll be